So this is our demo application at the moment, and of course it's fairly static. We have this output here on the screen, and we reach that output with help of our components, but as I mentioned, this never changes. It's static. We only have one state in this application, and that's this initial state which we see here. Now let's dive into how we can react to user events before we then have a look at how such events could trigger a state change. And when we want to start with events, I want to start fairly simple. I want to start with clicks on a button to which we want to react. And to get started with all of that, I'll go to the expense item where we output the title, the amount, and so on. And in there, I will also add a button below that div right before we close the card. And there I will just say change title. And if we now save that, we will see this button here. Now the styling is definitely not great, but this is also just a temporary button. We're going to remove it later. I'm just using it here so that we can start diving into events and state. Later we'll use what we learned in better places, in places that really help our application. But for a start, we now have these buttons, one per expense item component. And my goal now is simple. When this button here is clicked, I want to change the title which is being output here. Initially, the title which is being output is the title we get via props. But I want to change it whenever this button is clicked. And therefore, we of course first of all need to find out how exactly we can react to button clicks in React. And it turns out that this is rather simple. On all built-in HTML elements like divs and h2, and especially also buttons and so on, we have full access to all these native DOM events which we can listen to. So if you search for HTML button element, for example, you'll find an article about this button. And there, if you click on the DOM interface here, this HTML button element, you see from which other elements or from which other classes this inherits in the end. And here you see that the HTML button element is a more specific form of the HTML element, which is a more specific form of the element, which is a more specific form of the node, and so on. And if we click on element, for example, we actually will see that there are a bunch of events to which we can listen. For example, click and blur. And basically for all these default events, there is a prop equivalent in React, which we can add to these built-in HTML elements to listen to these events. So instead of adding a listener as we would normally do it, by, for example, selecting an element by ID and then adding an event listener like this, which would be the imperative way of doing that, in React we add an event listener by going to the JSX element, like this button, and there we add a special prop. But now it's not a prop which sets some value for this button, but instead it's a prop which starts with on. Because React exposes all these default events as props which start with on. And for example, here we can add on click. Now what this does is it adds an event listener for click events to this button. Now we just need to define what should happen when such a click occurs. And we do that by assigning a value to this click event. And the value here, and that's now important, of course has to be code which should be executed when that click occurs. And how do we define code that should eventually be executed in programming? Well, we create a function. So all these on props, all these event handler props want a function as a value. A function passed as a value for onClick and all these other on props, which then is executed when that event occurs. Now here we can either create this function on the fly, for example like this. We can create an anonymous arrow function like this, and then here we could console log clicked if we wanted to. And if we save that and we go back and open the developer tools here in the browser, and there we go to the console part, if I click the title, we see clicked. So this is how that works. This is how simple it is to add an event listener to a React element. Now, typically you don't just want to work with such anonymous inline arrow functions though. By the way, it doesn't have to be an arrow function. You could also create a function with the function keyword. You don't want to overdo it, at least, because it would mean that you put a lot of code here into your JSX block, into your JSX code, and that's generally not a good idea. You want to keep that lean and not put too much logic into your JSX code. Instead, you typically want to define a function before you return, and you can do that either with the function keyword or again by creating a const or a variable which holds an arrow function. So here we could add a click handler const, the name is up to you, which holds an arrow function like this. And in there, I can also say clicked with a couple of exclamation marks. And then here for this button, we just point at click handler. And that's important, by the way. We just point at it. We don't execute it here. You don't add parentheses here. Instead, you just repeat the name of the function, no matter if you created that function like this or with the function keyword. This does not matter. No matter how you defined it, you just point at it like this. Why? Because if you would add parentheses here, JavaScript would execute this when this line of code is being parsed. And this line of code is being parsed when the JSX code is returned. So it's then not executing click handler when the click occurs, but when this JSX code is evaluated. And that would be too early. That's why instead we just point at the click handler, we just point at the function, we pass a pointer at this function as a value to onClick, and then React basically memorizes this and executes the function for us whenever the click occurs, so that it's not executed when this is evaluated, but when the click occurs, which is exactly what we want. So now when I save that and I reload here, you see now we have clicked with multiple exclamation marks, which is the console log from this const. And that is how we can add event listeners to our elements. To all these built-in HTML elements, we can add supported event listeners basically. OnClick, for example, basically is available on every element. Some events are only available on specific elements, but that is all based on the default DOM behavior. If an element supports an event, then you can add a listener with React by adding such a on and then the event name prop. Just make sure that the event name starts with a capital character, like in the case of onClick here. And then you just point at a function, either defined inline here or better defined up front, and React will execute that function for you when that event occurs. That's how you add events. Now, one word about naming these functions. It is a convention which you don't have to follow, but which you might consider following, that you name your functions like this, if they are triggered upon an event, that you end with handler. This is not a must-do, and not every React developer does it, but it is a preference I personally have, and you will see it in a couple of projects out there, so that it's clear that this is a function which is not called by us somewhere else in our code, but that it is a function which we attach to an event listener so that it's eventually called by React when that event occurs. That's why I'm naming my event handler functions like this, ending with handler. But again, this is just my preference. You see it in a couple of projects. You might want to consider doing that, but you don't have to. But now with that, we know how we can react to events. How can we now change what is showing up on the screen though?